let's talk about the data mapper pattern. And this is the last data source pattern that we're going to be talking about, but in my opinion, it is one of the most important data source patterns to understand and one of the best ones to use. So what is a data mapper? Well, it's basically just a service class that transfers and retrieves your domain objects to and from a data source. It doesn't have to be a database, it could be a file or wherever you're storing your data. The best part about this pattern is that your domain objects don't need to know about how they are stored. They don't even have to know that they are being stored. So basically you just pass your domain objects to the data mapper. The data mapper takes care of all the persistence business, and your domain objects have no idea that the domain or that the data mapper even exists. So this is a lot better than, say, the row data gateway or the active record pattern, where if we look at our domain objects here, they have these methods on them to talk to the database, all these persistence methods. So your domain objects are strongly tied to your persistence layer. That's not what we have in the data mapper pattern. Everything is nicely separated and more maintainable. So when would you want to use this pattern? Well, we talked about how it separates your persistence layer from your domain model. So that means you can really only use this pattern if you have a domain model, which is usually the case. We usually deal with objects and entities. So if you have a domain model, you'd probably want to use this pattern. If you're just building like a really quick application, then maybe you can get away with doing something like an active record or row data gateway, where you have those persistence methods just baked right onto your object. But for the most part, I would suggest taking that extra step and adopting the data mapper pattern. And now that we understand how great this pattern is, let's go ahead and implement it in a demonstration. First things first, let's go over our domain model. So the domain that we're working with is a library. So I have one class or one entity for media, which is pretty much just something that gets checked in and checked out of a library. And then I have a table for the media. So we're going to be creating a data mapper that will communicate with this media table via our media entity that we have defined here. So first things first, let's go ahead and create a folder, and we're just going to call this data mappers. And inside here we're going to start off by creating an interface. So this is going to be an iDataMapper, and it's actually going to be generic, so it can take any type. And this interface is just going to define the operations that a typical data mapper would have. So that includes, we're doing task here because we're going to be doing asynchronous things. So the first method we're going to define is just like a get by ID, and we pass in the ID, and it'll return whatever entity that we have defined as T for our data mapper. So at get by ID, we'd also have a task to create an entity, and then we just pass in the entity, and then we'd have a task T to update an entity at a certain ID, and last but not least, we'd have a delete, which will just return true or false, and it's just a delete by ID. So as you can see, these are pretty much just your typical CRUD, create, read, update, delete methods. And one of the reasons we went ahead and defined this interface is because anyone who is depending on a data mapper only needs to depend on this interface, so you can really swap out your data source at any time. So it's just one big abstraction. Now with that in place, let's go ahead and define our data mapper. So this is going to be a class, and it's going to be the media data mapper. One thing to note is in Martin Fowler's Patterns of Enterprise Architecture, he suggests that you have one data mapper per domain object. So first things first, let's go ahead and make this a public class, and we are going to implement our iDataMapper. And this data mapper, the generic type is going to be our media, of course. Let's go ahead and import all of that. and then implement this interface. And right off the bat, let's make all of these async. So we can call everything asynchronously without blocking, which isn't really important because we're just dealing with a console application, so we don't really have any UI. But anyways, let's go ahead and implement these methods. So for create, first thing we want to do, and essentially what we're going to be doing for all these methods, is opening a SQL connection so that we can talk to the database. And make sure you install this package. And if we look at this constructor, whoops, we're also going to need a connection string, so we're going to actually get that through the constructor for our media data mapper. So it's just going to be a string for the connection string. And then we can generate a constructor off that. And there we go, we can pass that to our connection. And boom, just like that, we can connect to our database by calling await connection .open async. So we have an open connection to our database. Now we need to do something to our database. So we're in the create method. So what we're going to do is insert this entity into the database. So to do that, we're going to have to create the SQL command, which we can create from our connection. And then we need to define the command text, which is going to be an insert statement. So insert into our table is media. I think the columns are name and type. And then one thing we want to do is actually output the inserted .id. So this will give us the new ID that gets generated in our table, which is important because we are returning the created media from this method. So we want to get that ID so that the caller can get the ID of the entity that they created. And then the values that we're going to insert are the name and the type, which we're going to have to get from parameters. So let's add those parameters. Name is going to be the entity.name. Of course, entity is the media that we're trying to create. And then we're going to have another one for type, which is going to be entity.mediaType. And we're going to have to cast this to an int because that's how we store it in the database. And then last but not least, let's go ahead and execute this command. Execute, we want to execute as a scalar async. And if we look at scalar async, it'll return the first column of the first row that is returned by the query, which in our case is going to be the ID. So let's go ahead and grab that. And of course, it just returns an object, so we're going to have to cast it to an int. But we know it's going to be an int because that's the type of the ID. And then once we get that ID, we can set that on the entity and then return the entity to the caller. So there we go, all is good. And as we can see, our data mapper is taking care of mapping our entity to the database columns. So that's kind of like the big role of the data mapper. If you just, all the callers, they just call create, they pass in their entity, they don't have to know anything about how it is stored in the database or how it is mapped in the database. The data mapper takes care of all of that. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good about this mapper. Let's go ahead and test it out in our program.cs. Actually, what the heck is this disgusting file? When did that get there? Okay. Let's go into our program.cs, and I'm going to have to get a connection string, which I have right over here. So let me just copy that in. There we go. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a media data mapper. Let's import that. And then we'll pass in our connection string. And now we can call mapper.create. And all we have to do is pass in a new media. Make sure we import that as well. And we can give it some data, so we'll say media type equals media type dot book, and name we'll say is cat in the hat. And then we have to call result because we're not really in an async method. And let's actually put this into a field or a variable so that we can look at the results. Let's put a breakpoint here, and we'll also take a look at our table as well, and let's run this. So there we go, we hit our breakpoint, we get our newly created media, we look at our table, it's sitting right in there. I don't know why the ID is 1007. You'd think it would be like 6, but that's what it's going to do for us. But end of the day, it does work, so we are successfully mapping. All I had to do was call create, pass in the media that I wanted to create, so everything flows very nicely. Now let's head back into our data mapper and implement the rest of these methods. So next up, we're going to do the getById method. So let's go ahead and I'm actually just going to copy all of this because all the connection stuff is all pretty much the same. We're going to have to make a command and all that. But of course it's going to be a little bit different. So instead of an insert, we're going to be doing a select. So we're going to select star from media where the ID equals the ID that we pass into this method. And then the only parameter that we have is ID, which we got right there. And then what we're going to do is instead of executing a scalar, we're going to execute, I believe it's a reader async. And this will give us back a SQL data reader. Before I had been doing like data adapters and data tables, but someone actually commented and said that data reader is more efficient, I believe. Or it might be easier to use, I don't know, it was something, and I looked it up, and it looked a lot easier to use, so we're going to be testing it out here. So now what we have to do with this reader is call read async, and what this is going to do is it'll return true or false if there is a row in the reader. So we're going to call that if there is a row, then we're going to return a new media, and then we're going to grab all the data from the row that is currently pointed to by our SQL data reader. So we can say the ID, well, we don't have to get that from the reader because we get it from the method, but we can say the name equals reader dot get string, because our name is a string. And then one thing about the SQL data reader is that it takes in the index of the column, which I don't really like, but there's also a method, I believe it's get ordinal, and then you pass it the name of the column, which I would prefer is giving the name of the column rather than the index of the column. So the name is just the name column, and that gives us back the index of the column, which we then pass into this getString method. And then we can do the same thing for our media type, which is going to be reader.get. We're going to have to do get field value, and then we're going to say that we want a media type, so it'll automatically cast the value from the column to a media type. And we got to do the same thing, and the name of that column I believe is just type. And there we go. So another thing we have to do is if there's nothing in the reader, then we'll just return null, or you could throw an exception, whatever you want to do. So let's go back to our program.cs and let's comment out our create, and instead what we're going to say is media equals mapper.getById, and we'll get the first record in our table, and we'll put a breakpoint right there and test this out. And there we go. That is indeed our first record. So our getById does work. So we just called this method our data mapper did all the mapping and returned our domain object. So let's go ahead and implement the rest of these methods. Now for this update method, I'm actually going to start off by just copying everything from our create method because it's going to be pretty similar actually. Except one thing we're going to have to update is this command text. So this is going to be an update. We're going to update the media table, set the name equal to a name parameter, the type equal to a type parameter, and we're going to do this where the ID matches an ID parameter. So we're going to have to update our parameters here. So our name parameter is going to be the name of this entity. Our type parameter is going to be the type of the entity that we're sending in the update, and then the ID is going to be this ID that gets passed in. So that's actually the only thing that we're going to change. So let's go ahead and add that, and after that we're going to have to get rid of that and execute non-query async, so that'll just do the update, and then we'll put the ID onto this entity that gets passed in and just send that back because that'll be the fully updated media entity. So that's actually all we have to do for our update command. So that was pretty simple. Now before we test that, let's just implement the delete real quick. So this is going to be, let's just copy everything from our create again, because I like how it just opens the connection. All we gotta do is change this command. So this is gonna be a delete from media where ID equals an ID parameter, and then all we have to do is add that as a parameter, and we will return, we're gonna execute a non-query async, and this actually returns the number of rows affected. So if more than 0 rows are affected, that means the delete was successful and will return true. If 0 rows were affected, that means it was unsuccessful. So now I feel pretty good. This is pretty much the full implementation of a data mapper. So let's go ahead and test out these last few methods. So we'll have an update, and we'll update record number 1, and we'll actually just update it with all of these values. So record number 1 is going to be Cat in the Hat instead of Singleton Sean. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint there, and we'll even make it a movie. Okay. So let's step over that, and then we'll refresh this table, and there we go. We got Cat in the Hat, and it is a movie. And then one thing I'm going to do is let's test our delete. So we're going to delete 1007. So we can just get rid of all this. Just call mapper.delete 1007, and we'll get the result as well. And let's see if we get rid of this record. We got success. We refresh, and it is no longer there. So our data mapper is fully functioning, and most importantly, our domain model is completely separated from our persistence layer. So that is the best part about the data mapper, and why I think that it is the most important data source pattern to understand. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed this video, have any questions, criticisms, or comments, be sure to leave them below in the comment section. But other than that, if you guys enjoyed the video, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.